Okay, so this videocast will walk and talk you through the key points of Richard Evans' excellent prologue to his second book in his trilogy of books about the Third Reich. The second book is the Third Reich in Power. What he does in this prologue is he basically summarises most of the key points, or many of the key points, from his first book, The Coming of the Third Reich. So we'll take this paragraph by paragraph from the first section of the prologue, and then there is a second videocast that looks at the second half of the prologue, which focuses more on the rise of Hitler and the Nazis during this period. Okay, so in the first paragraph, Evans focuses in on the Second Reich, okay, 1817 to 1918. The key point that Evans is making in this opening section is that there is an interpretation which Evans doesn't particularly agree with, that to really understand why Nazism was able to grow in Germany in the 1920s and take power in 1933, that you've actually got to look back into the Second Reich before World War One. That effectively the seeds from which Nazism grew were planted in the Second Reich. And the argument is that the Second Reich was very, very militaristic. As you know, the Prussian army had a dominant position, and also that the Second Reich was very authoritarian. It was very anti-democratic. And a very, very common interpretation that many historians have used is that effectively Nazism had those traits. So as a result of that, Nazism was able to grow. Evans, though, very clearly in this opening section, points out that interpretation is far too simplistic. He pretty much rejects that interpretation, and he points out the weaknesses of it. So, for example, he says that at that same time, in the late 19th century, in many ways, Germany was more democratic than Britain. He points out that, for example, by 1912, the SPD, the Social Democratic Party, was the largest political party in the Second Reich, and it was a very, very strong believer in democracy. Okay, it was a left-wing party, but it was not an anti-democratic party. So the argument is that democracy was growing and had strong roots inside the Second Reich. Okay, so therefore to argue that Nazism was able to take root in Germany because of its anti-democratic tradition, Evans points out, is too simplistic. Evans, though, then moves into his second paragraph, and as a good historian would, he's made very clear where he stands, but of course he does need to be balanced, and so he then explores he digs deeper into this, and effectively in his second paragraph he does acknowledge that there were definitely some features of the Second Reich which played a part in putting the Nazis into power in the early 1930s. So it's not as simplistic as just, he's not completely rejecting the old argument, he's just simply saying that the old argument is too simplistic. So, for example, he mentions the entrenched power of the aristocrats, okay, the Prussian elites that we know about. The aristocrats, of course, ultimately were the people who put Hitler into power in 1933. Okay, von Papen is a classic example of that. Hindenburg himself, President Hindenburg, was the man who appointed Hitler as Chancellor in 1933. Well, he again was a Prussian junker. Evans points out about the hostility of big industrialists to organised labour. That was a key feature of the Second Reich, of the Germany before World War I. And again, if you go to 1932 into 1933, when Hitler was appointed Chancellor, big business were major string pullers who encouraged President Hindenburg to make Hitler Chancellor because the Nazis could crush communism. Yes, the Reichstag, its powers were limited. Okay, so that's obviously a sort of key feature. You can argue in one way, yes, that the Reichstag was a universal manhood suffrage. It was a much more democratic parliament in many ways than the British Parliament at the time, but at the same time, the accountability, as you know, from in the Second Reich. Was upwards. Okay, the Chancellor gave account to the Kaiser, not to the Reichstag. Catholics and Socialists were attacked as enemies of the Reich. Okay, well, again, that was a sort of key feature of Nazi Germany. Hitler, as you know, saw enemies of the Reich everywhere. Very importantly, Evans says that the Catholics and the SPD in the Second Reich tried to respond to their being attacked by sticking rigidly to the rule of law, by integrating themselves, by being very cooperative with the system. And those were weaknesses that prevented them opposing Hitler in 1933 when Hitler took power. If the Catholics and SPD had stood more firmly against him, then they could have prevented Hitler's rise to power. So that's the point about their behavioural traits. Extremist parties emerged from 1819 onwards because they felt the unification was incomplete. There was extremism, and the extremists in the Second Reich tapped into the lower middle class fears of the modern age. We've talked about the Mittelstand. Well, the Nazis were a Mittelstand party. There was Jews, there were only 1% of Germans were Jews, not many, but there was anti-Semitism. Jews were criticised as being scapegoats in the Second Reich. And there was polarisation. Okay, mainstream parties such as the Centre and the SPD were losing votes to extremist groups. So all of these features from the Second Reich were likewise factors that helped put Hitler into power. Many years later, so there was continuity. There was there was a common trend there. In the next section of his prologue, Evans moves to the year 1914. Now, as you can see from the photograph there, that very famous photograph taken on the day World War I broke out of the crowd gathering in Munich. Very famously, there's a picture of the young Adolf Hitler standing in the crowd, waiting to join the German army. And why is that important? Because although obviously Hitler's not famous at that time, later on, when he did enter politics and when he became the leader of Germany, he frequently referred to that particular day as the greatest moment of his life. Because what he picked up there was that war created national unity. Now, of course, what we have covered then is this sort of notion of the Bergfriede. Okay, this was the Bergfriede. The Kaiser declared that he recognised no parties, only Germans. That what war did is it ended national division. The parties came together, started working together. From Hitler's point of view, this was the spirit of 1914, that his aim as a politician was to always recreate that moment. Okay, so as again, we'll learn about this, but one of the key things that Hitler wanted to do was effectively create a one-party state, and as we know, Hitler valued war. He saw war as a positive thing because it created national unity. So the key point that Evans was making here, there were political extremists on both the left wing and right wing before World War One, but they lacked impact. But what happened with World War One, when World War One broke out, the outbreak of war, and in particular the sort of spirit of national unity, was a catalyst that changed the situation, and it made extremism more dangerous. Okay, it popularised extremist ideas such as groups on the extreme right. The Nazi Party did not exist in 1914, but men like Hitler were there, and that moment sort of like motivated him to enter politics. So later on in the 1920s, and as we move into the 1930s, the spirit of 1913 became a mythical symbol of national unity. That key word, mythical. People were very nostalgic for that moment. They forgot the disaster that followed, in a sense, the 4 years of war and the death and destruction. Was almost forgotten. What was remembered was that moment of national unity. Another key feature of the war was the emergence of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, again as mythical, heroic figures. One of the arguments is that in the Kaiser Reich it promoted heroic figures. Bismarck was a mythical figure. So as we move into the 1920s and the 1930s, after World War One, many Germans nostalgically looked back at these heroic figures, Hindenburg and Ludendorff as the generals on the Eastern Front, Bismarck as the creator of Germany. And again, Hitler as a young politician tapped into that, and he wanted to become a new heroic leader of Germany. Evans then moves into the period after World War One. The immediate impact of World War One on Germany was a national disaster. Okay, so he's focusing on the immediate impact, the years 1919 to 23. All Germans were united in their resentment of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles when they were eventually imposed on Germany. Remember, we did this in the course. Initially, the first 6 months after the end of World War One, before the Treaty of Versailles was signed, there was a very strong pro-Republican feeling. 76% of voters who voted for the first Reichstag in January 1919 were pro-Republican. They voted for parties that supported the Republic. But then the shock of Versailles united Germans in resentment, a great deal of hostility towards the parties that had signed it, which resulted in polarisation, with many voters going to either the extreme left, the communists, or over to the right-wing parties. Now, the Nazis on the extreme right didn't exist in 1919, and they didn't emerge for another 10 years, but the main right-wing party were the German Nationalist Party that gathered a lot of the vote after the Treaty of Versailles. Evans also talks about the decline of international cooperation, the post-World War, the post-war world, countries were not cooperating with each other. And that was a disaster for Germany that was kind of like cut adrift without support. It needed support. The international economy was effectively destroyed. Evans states that very boldly. He said it would not recover for another 30 years. It wasn't until the late 1940s and early 1950s that we'd start to see the international economy recovering. So the German economy, cut off from any form of real support outside, already in crisis as a result of the war, heavily in debt. There was already inflation was taking root, and inflation turned into hyperinflation in 1923. In Evans' fifth paragraph, he then moves into this the middle period of the 1920s, which historically, and again at GCSE, it's often taught as being the golden era. Okay, the mid-1920s being a sort of golden era in which things seem to be getting better. A time that's often associated with Gustav Stresemann, the foreign minister of the Republic during this period. Well, Evans very clearly makes the point that actually this was not a golden era at all. World War One continued to have that impact in the medium term. Okay, although the economy seemed to be recovering, and Evans doesn't specifically mention things such as the Dawes Plan, but again, you'll be aware of that. The key feature is that the damage had been done by the early period. The middle classes especially were fragmented. That sort of early period, especially the year 1923, which had wiped out their savings, and the Treaty of Versailles, which had turned them against the Republic, was still a factor that was sort of like ticking away beneath the surface. So although the economy was recovering, inflation had stabilised, it was not a positive time from the viewpoint of the middle classes. There was rising unemployment. Yeah, okay, prices had been stabilised, but there was unemployment during this period. And in particular, German businesses were anti-government. They saw the new Weimar government as investing too much in welfare for ordinary Germans and not putting enough money into helping the economy recover. Yes, money was coming into Germany, but it was coming in from America, the Dawes Plan, etc. And so there was that sort of basic feeling is that the government, the new Republican governments that had betrayed Germany by signing the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, that memory had not gone away. These new Weimar governments were not investing properly in business. They were pouring their money into welfare systems. Also, that's economically, socially and culturally, the 1920s was a very, very modern time. Now, we've already talked about this sort of like theme, about how in particular the lower middle classes in the Second Reich were anti-modern. The modern age hadn't been helping them, in particular the Mittelstand, squeezed between the threat of socialism from below organised labour and the rise of big business from above. Well, that sort of anti-modernist trend became a feature in the 1920s because Germany in the Weimar Republic was so modern culturally, all sorts of exciting experimentation was going on, that many of the sort of threatened social classes felt threatened by cultural change. So new types of architecture and art, architecture such as the Bauhaus movement, new music, new literature, and in particular Berlin was sort of seen to be a hotbed of immoral culture, nightclubs, etc. Women were very free in the 1920s Germany, and many women were going out drinking, going to bars, living a lifestyle that many middle class Germans disapproved of. And then finally, of course, you've got the political weaknesses. Again, common feature from GCSE. So although this was a time, on the surface seemed to be a time of recovery, those underlying political problems continued to exist. Weak coalition governments, largely as a result of proportional representation, and in particular that Article 48 that said if governments can't pass laws through Parliament, through the Reichstag, because of the coalition issue, then you can get it signed off by presidential signature, Article 48. So the easy temptation to get a law passed by getting the President of the Republic to sign it, rather than by taking the proposed law to Parliament. And then finally, Evans, in this section, moves to the Great Depression, the period of the early 1930s, which of course began in October 1929, the Great Depression, with the Wall Street crash, when America withdrew her loans, and effectively the house of cards collapsed. And Germany then entered the sort of final phase in which extremism grew. Okay, and always remember that it was not just the right wing, the Nazis, that seized the advantage. It was also the communists as well. Okay, and that's what we call the polarisation of the vote moving to the two extremes. The key feature of the Great Depression, remember, was massive unemployment. Okay, so by 1932, 6 million Germans had lost their work. Now, those Germans were drawn from different social classes. As a general rule, the unemployed from the working classes turned to the extreme left wing, the communists. So the communist support increased. The communists got greater representation in the Reichstag. But on the other extreme, there was a increase in the vote on the extreme right, the Nazi Party. Now, the Nazi Party had been a tiny party before 1929. In the elections of 1928, they only got 12 seats, which was about 2.6% of the German vote. But already the Nazis had started to capture, even before 1929, in local kind of village elections, they had started to capture the votes of farmers. Remember, the agricultural recession hit Germany before 1929. The agricultural recession hit Germany from about 1927 onwards. But in 1929, suddenly, when the Great Depression hit Germany and the communists started to attract support, then the middle classes were absolutely terrified, and the middle classes turned to the extreme right. They rejected the conventional right-wing parties that they normally voted for, and they saw the Nazis as a new alternative. Now, a key feature of this period was political violence. So as we move into the early 30s, government has broken down, effectively strong government has broken down. You've got polarisation of politics. The parties of the centre that are governing Germany simply do not have the support to pass laws. So the legitimacy of the Republic is being undermined. Okay, always there has been a question mark ever since 1919 about whether the pro-Republican parties have got the right to rule Germany. Ever since the Treaty of Versailles, it's kind of like those doubts have always been there, but in the mid 1920s, they sat below the surface during the time of apparent economic recovery. But now, in the early 1930s, those old doubts have resurfaced, and with that polarisation, you've got political violence. What that basically means is, on the streets, the extreme left and the extreme right are taking it out into street battles. Another key feature, just pointing out going to the final point, was the anti-republican bias of the Conservative establishment, which we'll pick up more when we go into the next podcast about the rise to power of the Nazis. Because remember, ever since 1919 and the Eber-Gruner Pact, the army and the judiciary are pretty much the same men from the Kaiser Reich. And they are propping up the Weimar Republic, and yet the army and the judiciary are biased. Okay, they are anti-republican, they are right-wing. They have never really approved of the Republic, and yet it is their job to make it work. And now that the times have turned against the Republic and that it seems to be breaking down through violence and lack of strong government, really their role is essential to make it work. And yet the army and the judiciary were sympathetic, especially for the Nazi Party. Okay, so that's the end of this video cast. And move on to the second one, which looks at the same period, but from the perspective of Hitler and the Nazi Party. Thank you.